Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I'm Katie Hasty. I am movies editor for Entertainment Weekly. Morgan Neville here, I think, has probably witnessed a few screenings now at this point where people are dabbing their eyes a little bit or pretending there's something a little bit.
Is everybody okay here?
Are we okay? Good. I guess, you know, waiting for people's reactions. You screen this at major festivals so far. Do you feel like afterward people come up to you and still need something out of you? Are they ready to let go after this is done?
It definitely lingers. I mean, even making the film, I remember, it was a very emotional experience making the film. And, you know, I tell people when I'm making documentaries often that to my subjects, I say, this is going to be therapy for you, for me to make a documentary about you. Making this film, I was like, oh, this is therapy for me. Like, this film was so much kind of the therapy that I needed at the time, and spending 2017 making this film was like the best bubble we could have been in. I mean, just everybody that worked on the film, it seeped into everything we were doing. You know, the editors, the producers, like, we were happy to go to work. We were everybody treated everybody respectfully, and, you know, it just was like, you know, we all got into the gestalt of MR.Rodgers and just wanted to stay there as long as we could. But even when I remember at the very end, we had done the color correct, and we had done the score, and then we mixed it, and we were watching the final mix back in a theater, and we all started crying. And we had all made the film. It's just something about it that to us, it felt, you know, we didn't know how other people would react, but to us it felt right.
How do you even know when you're done with something like this? Like when there's it seems like there was so much more you could explore, but how do you even decide what makes the cutting room floor, and when do you decide to say, yep, we've pretty much cleared the bar for MR.Rodgers now?
I mean, you never know. I mean, people always laugh about this stuff, but I did a documentary called 20 Feet from Stardom. And not that I'm...
He won an Oscar, guys.
But I remember premiering that at Sundance, and we never had a good test screening of that for Friends. And we screened it at Sundance, and it blew everybody away, and we sold it at 5 a.m., and it was like a classic Sundance experience. But you really never know until you share it with an audience, kind of what people are going to think.
Do you feel like, as you talk to some pretty rare subjects here, you talk to his kids, you talk to people who, you know, you wouldn't necessarily think that these were accessible people. How do you even begin to have a relationship or gain somebody's trust in that, especially since, you know, Fred Rogers died in 2003, so you didn't even talk to him. So how do you gain that access?
Well, I mean, going back to the beginning of the story, I think the real seed of this film started maybe about 7 years ago. I was working on a documentary with Yo-Yo Ma, and one day at lunch, right when I was getting to know him, I happened to ask him, out of the blue, how did you figure out how to be a famous person? And without hesitating, he said, oh, MR.Rodgers taught me. And I kind of chuckled like you did. And he said, no, I'm not kidding. You know, I went on a show many times, but the first time I went on a show, he recognized that I was struggling with this. And he really went out of his way to mentor me over years of how to use my notoriety as a force for positive social change and not as something that was going to be a weight around my neck. And it kind of blew my mind when he told me that, because I grew up loving MR.Rodgers, but I didn't think about him for 40 years. And so in that moment, it was like the kernel that made me think about doing this film. And cut to many years later, as he kept coming up in the culture again and again. And somebody would send a video, or I'd watch a commencement address, and then So I called up Yo-Yo's son, who is a filmmaker, and I said, you knew Fred Rogers, and I have this idea. What do you think about a documentary about Fred Rogers? And he said, I love that idea. I want to produce it for you. So he's my producer. And he was a great partner. So the two of us went down to Pittsburgh, where everybody in the Mr. Rogers neighborhood lives. And we met with everybody, and we sat down with Joanne Rogers, with Mrs. Rogers. And we said, and this was my pitch, I said, I don't want to make a film about the biography of the man. I want to make a film about the ideas of Fred Rogers. And she said, well, that's good, because Fred always said if anybody made a story out of his life, it would be the most boring story ever. And so she was great. Like, we had a great conversation. And this shows how wise she is, which is at the end of that conversation, she gave us her blessing to do this and to give up all control, because that was my condition. She said, don't make him a saint. And I thought that was so smart of her. Because if anything, I think the trap that Fred was in was that people thought of him as two-dimensional. You know, he was kind of like a cultural caricature. And I think that was something that he was never able to quite escape. And that frustration of people not understanding the depth of his mission. But I think part of that, the other trap of that, is the sanctification of Mr. Rogers is equally paper thin. So to say, oh, he was a saint, you know, he did nice things and kids loved him and, you know, kumbaya, you know, that's equally kind of damning. So to show how much he struggled, I think both humanizes him, but I think even more importantly, it doesn't mean that the things he fought for can only be left to the saints. It means that we all have to struggle for those things. Somehow those don't exist on another plane for the better angels to take care of. It means that we all have responsibility in this world. And that was the thing that we really kind of grabbed onto in the beginning.
It doesn't sound like a profound experience at all. I'm sure it has no effect on your day-to-day or as a storyteller. What do you feel like you've been able to carry on into your own work in deciding on what you want to do? Did this, working on this, have an effect on how you storytell?
I mean, it's interesting because I want each of my films to reflect the subject, you know, and what I realized is his style was simple and deep. That was the thing. And it's very easy to look at things like that and think, oh, if something's simple, it's shallow or it's easy. And it's very, very difficult to do something that's simple and deep. You know, and if people say, oh, well, you know, you just throw together a bunch of clips and, you know, it's done, you know, and it's not that at all. It's like the removing of things is kind of the most important thing. One of my friends, an artist, had given me advice, which he had always said to himself, which I think about all the time, which is you have to be a more careless artist and a more ruthless editor. And I think part of the experience is just trying anything and trying to kind of amass what you can, think of every idea you can, and then just be brutal with your material. And really understand that to serve your material means you have to take everything out that's not essential. And that's exactly what Fred did. I mean, that's the memo that we quote in the middle of the film where he's doubting his ability to write scripts. You realize that Fred was kind of a tortured artist about it. I mean, he really doubted himself many times because to do something as seemingly simple as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, in fact, was incredibly difficult. And that's why many times he wondered if he could even continue doing the show.
Did you set out to kind of correct any misconceptions about him? I mean, I love that you included, you know, the bit about, you know, I heard he was a Navy SEAL and killed a bunch of guys and things like that. Was there something that you set out to correct, or did you feel like there were some misconceptions that you aimed to kind of, you know, screw tightly?
Well, I mean, that's one of them. You know, and even working on the film, you know, I remember getting into a cab and somebody says, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm working on a film about Mr. Rogers. And they're like, oh, you know, he was a Navy SEAL. You know, and so you have to deal with those things. Like, it's again, it's like to me, it's about this intersection of Mr. Rogers and the cultural conversation, and turning that around and saying, what is it about us that makes us want to take a person like him and attach some narrative to it? Is it that it makes us feel better by putting him into a box like this? And I don't, it's all these things about how we treat our cultural figures, and particularly in a day and age where so many of them have fallen so far from grace. You kind of expect there to be, a dark underbelly. And kind of, to me, the revelation about the difference between Mr. Rogers and Fred is that Fred was like a better version of Mr. Rogers in real life. A deeper, more complex, more committed, more human version of Mr. Rogers.
Also quite the accomplished musician. I think people forget that he did a lot of composition. That must have been really tough to not just do an entire documentary about his work.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote every song on the show. And he went to Rollins College in Orlando, Florida. He was a composition major. And he was an amazing musician. Johnny Costa, who was a longtime piano player, was one of the all-time great jazz pianists, kind of in the Art Tatum mold. And Fred loved that. Again, you could do a whole documentary about, Mr. Rogers and music. But it's just not what we were going for. And as much as I love music and have done many music documentaries, I had to be ruthless.
I was about to say, yeah. You've got kind of the background, the music background. What else did you kind of learn about filmmaking, making this one in particular?
I don't know. I mean, I've been making films for 25 years. I feel like, I learn something with everyone, but I feel like I keep circling the same ideas. Even though the films are very different, the ideas are the same. And so I realized at some point, and I don't always know what the film's about when I'm starting to make it, but this film in many ways, to me, became about common ground. And where can we find places in our culture that transcend sense of party, identity, religion, things like that. And I made a film called Best of Enemies about Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley and the debates they had, which was kind of the inverse documentary of this one, but kind of a mirror version. It's about television in the same era and kind of what goes wrong. And in a way, Mr. Rogers is a model for what could go right with television, the potential of television, the potential for media to bring people together. And I think part of it is that he was speaking to kids who were like 2 to 6 years old was his main demographic. And they're not even people then. A 2-year-old has no sense of identity, not even a sense of self. So in a way, what he predates any sense of identity we have. So in that way, it's a way of short-circuiting that he comes from this or that. It's like and what he talked about was even kind of, this is how you're supposed to be a person. This is how you're supposed to treat people. It's these basic humanist values that he was trying to impart to kids. So in that way, finding a cultural figure who, in a way, sidesteps all of our cultural baggage was kind of a gift for me. And it wasn't the thing I thought about the first time I thought about making this film. That was more intuitive, but that was the thing that I realized I've actually been making many films about. And even, I just did a TV show called Ugly Delicious we were talking about. Very different kind of show from this, but also about culture as a place to bring people together. Otherness, it's like the thing I keep coming back to with everything I make, how culture can bring people together.
Yeah. Do you feel like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood could actually be made today? Do you feel like as an entity that could get done? You've worked in finance, you've worked in making films, television, you've spun the deals. Could this have gotten made?
Well, maybe in a DIY way, but at a network level, no. Even in the 80s, Fred was saying, if I come along today, I wouldn't be on television. I think he was so much, timing was everything for him. He was born at that moment that he came of age like the very moment television came of age. If he was born 5 years before or 5 years later, I don't think it would have happened. It just, everything about it was, he matured on the exact same trajectory television did. And his kind of brilliant stroke was realizing at the very, very beginning that this new box in our living room is going to affect everything about our culture. And there are going to be generations of children raised by this box. And this is going to be their main outlet with the outside world. And if all we're trying to do is sell them sugar and toys, our culture is not going to be better. So he, in that moment when he was 21, saw the future of television and changed his entire life plans to go follow that.
What, if you had him around today, would you have asked him?
How do you maintain hope, I think. I mean, he was a man of faith. It's another word for hope, that, and I think a lot about grace. So grace was something that he talked about all the time. In his office, he had a sign with the Greek word, he spoke Greek, but with the Greek word for faith, or for grace, which is charity, which is the basis for charity, comes from the same word. And kind of the religious definition of grace is the undeserved goodness bestowed upon you by God. But it's basically the idea of doing good unto others with no expectation of anything back. Not because they deserve it or don't deserve it, not because you expect something back. And I feel like we live in a culture that's honestly so disgraceful at times that all of us look for our goodness to be transactional. We think of things as quid pro quo. Doing unto others is always seen as, some expectation of getting something back. And I think Fred's ability to do all this with zero expectation of anything back is intimidating, But it's something that I think is, beyond worthy, and that I can attempt my best moments to live up to.
Speaking of hope, you're speaking to a room of creatives, people who also probably want to do some hope in their career. What is your advice to young filmmakers, to young creatives, in terms of choosing their subject matter and blowing it out like you have?
I could talk about this all day. I started in documentary film, and I came out of journalism. And so my whole thing in my career has been about iterating. Like, I know a lot of filmmakers, this is probably less true for you, but get very caught on one idea, and I'm going to make this film for 5 years, and then I'll make the next film. I just feel like the more you do it, the better you get. And even things you do that aren't necessarily I'll do commercials sometimes, and I can make money doing that, but I actually learn all kinds of things that I wouldn't normally do, or doing TV, or doing, just the more you do, the better you get. And the more often you do it, the better you get. So in a way, I feel like, don't be too precious. I love deadlines, I actually do. I was just like, do it and move on. And particularly when you work in documentary or anything with nonfiction, you don't control everything. It's not like writing a book or making a painting where you can control the canvas. There are things beyond your control. So to feel like you can control it 100% is a fool's errand. So in that way, I feel like it's more like rolling the dice. And the more often you roll the dice, the better the odds are that you're gonna win something.
Creativity is a gamble, you guys.
That is true.
I think maybe a couple people might have some questions for Marvin. I see one right there, shot right up. Yes, sir.
I actually have 3, but I'll wait.
Let's do one.
Okay. Just the most important question. Who do we talk to about helping get the word out about this thing when it's coming out?
Social media?
I'm aware of that, in terms of whoever's marketing the film or whatnot.
the film, I'm really excited about this film because we sold it to Focus Features, which is part of Universal, and they're gonna push it out in a big way for a documentary, which is great. And the trailer did incredibly well for a documentary trailer. So I feel like there's a groundswell of anticipation. There are people here from Focus Features who probably have a better answer than I do, but I just, we're all out there kind of beating the bushes and talking about it and doing screenings and trying to get people to be aware of it. But I also feel like this is a film that there's something about watching it, hopefully you felt this too, but seeing it with other people, I think helps the experience of the film, but I also feel like it's just, to me, it's kind of why I want to make movies, why I want, as opposed to just people watching things at home, which I do normally, but to get people together in a communal experience, that's kind of the dream of what a filmmaker wants to do with the right film at the right time. So till people come out on June 8th, we open in theaters around the country. So spread the news. Thanks.
Yeah. Right there.
Yeah, I had a question about when he's testifying to Congress. I've seen the original video after seeing your trailer and being so excited. I watched several of Mr.Rodgers videos on YouTube, and it shows his complete testimony. And I noticed you guys edited out the final line of his song lyrics when he says at the end there. He says something about, and a girl can be one day a woman, and a boy can be one day a man. And I was just wondering, what was the thinking behind the decision to edit that?
I mean, his full testimony is about 12 minutes long, so there are editorial decisions that have to be made. But there's also that last line of the song, even though it's bringing up an interesting point, it felt like it was bringing up a new idea that was distracting you from the moment rather than keeping you in the moment. It was making you think about that other idea. So that was editorial decision to kind of keep you there.
It's wonderful. It's totally moving and transportive work, which is great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Some more questions? Right at the front then.
So you're dealing with a figure that literally has thousands of hours of footage about him. At what point in the production did you decide, let's animate Daniel? Let's have that be a part of the story instead of more footage of Fred Rogers?
Early on, we decided we wanted to do that. And there are a couple of things. This is other kind of more documentary advice, but to me, there are all kinds of pitfalls of making biodocs, just a documentary about a person's life. And part of it is this feeling of like the Wikipediaization of storytelling, which is like feeling like you have to check every box and say, they were born here, they did this, then they went here and they did this. And to me, it's both bad filmmaking and bad history, and it drives me crazy. So part of it was trying to avoid starting the film in his childhood, trying to avoid, and honestly, the material from his childhood was very typical black material you would get for a documentary. Black and white photos of a little boy, and we could shoot his neighborhood and things. And to me, what I wanted from his childhood were the things that influenced the show later, which were really the fears he experienced as a child. And then just thinking about the ways to make that come alive. And with Daniel being the kind of avatar for the childhood Fred, it just became this idea of kind of coming up with our own storybook version of Fred as a child, but with Daniel there. And then we actually did a lot of research into children's books of the 30s and 40s, and a kind of a style that came out of that we wanted to use in the animation. That was kind of the filmmaker thinking behind it.
You have one in the back in the white?
I heard that Mr. Rogers responded to everybody who ever wrote to them, which is somebody who's on YouTube is extraordinarily difficult. And I'm wondering, as somebody who has a very kind and caring community that I would like to be a kind of Mr. Rogers presence to, how do you handle it when you can't respond to everybody? How did he handle it?
I mean, he at one point he got more letters in America than anybody, which is incredible. And he responded to every letter he ever got. In his archives, which are in at St. Vincent University. They have pretty much every letter he ever got. There are over 1 million. And it was something he spent hours on every week. I mean, every day. He'd spend a couple hours a day in the morning, and then at least one day on the weekend doing correspondence. And he had people that helped him eventually, and 80% of those letters were probably, "I like you, hi Mr. Rogers," you know. And, you know, he would have he'd have kind of form note, but he would hand sign everyone. But if anybody asked a difficult question, he would really take time to write a really thoughtful answer. And sometimes he would even write a separate letter to the parents and one to the child. And there's actually one of my favorite things about in researching the film was this book called Dear Mr. Rogers, which is a kind of a thin book of letters that he got and the responses he wrote. And some of those letters are just, you know, they'll kill you. You know, like talking about a sibling who's died, talking about disease they've had, you know, just these really tough situations, and seeing how Fred would talk to the child and sometimes talk to the parent, and how, in a way, I feel like that was his most real work. I know he took that incredibly seriously. I mean, that was him ministering, essentially. So I think he saw the correspondence as part of his ministry, but also as somebody says in the film, or maybe I'm trying to remember I think he says in the film that he regarded that relationship, Margaret McFarlane says in the film, he regards the relationship with the child as a real relationship. Because to the child it's real. And he always spoke individually to children. He never said, "Hey kids," it was always like, "How are you doing?" You know, is this, and he would leave space for a child to fill that in and respond. And so if he ever met a child in the real world, he didn't act like, "I don't know who you are, stop bothering me." It was like, "No, we have a relationship. You know who I am, and I'm here, and tell me your name." And so in a way, the television was like, it was the thing he had to do to fulfill his mission, but it was just one small kind of part of his ministry, and kind of in a way the reluctant part. Like he was the least likely famous person ever. He didn't like television. He didn't want to be on TV. He wanted to serve children, and this was the best way to do it and reach the greatest number of children. But I feel like the correspondence actually was a huge part of that. In terms of how to respond to everybody, I'm not even that great at it, so I don't know.
I imagine as a filmmaker too, you kind of capturing his life as you did and his philosophies, people actually want to talk to you afterward, like a Mr. Rogers proxy. Or do people like tell you their story, their Mr. Rogers story? Like what are some good ones you've got?
I've heard some great stories. There's so many Mr. Rogers stories, and it's because even your coworker who interviewed me today,
Anthony Bresigan, Holler.
had a Mr. Rogers story. Did he tell you his story? Yeah, which he had met him in an elevator once and did what everybody would do and said, "Oh, Mr. Rogers, I loved your show." They were standing together in the elevator and said, actually, not long ago, when maybe he was in college at the time, said, "Not long ago, I was actually having a hard time and I came across your show and it meant a lot to me." And rather than saying, "Oh, thanks," he said, "Well, why don't you sit down with me and tell me about the hard time you were going through?" And they sat down together and had a whole conversation about it. And that was exactly the kind of thing he would do. I've heard stories like that over and over. Somebody would meet him and then they would get a letter from him. Somebody else told me a story that their friend was in Pittsburgh. They were hitchhiking and a car pulled over and it was Mr. Rogers. And he said, "I'll drive you anywhere you want to go on the condition that you never hitchhike again."
Be safe out there, kids. Right here. Yes, you. Hi. Oh, 1 second.
Well, thank you. I wanted to ask, if he was still around today, what do you think his opinion of the world today as we live in would be like, compare and contrast to his time? I see you shaking your head, you're like, you don't want to answer.
I mean, it's unknowable in some ways, other than the fact that he was, you know, always trying to find a way to understand, not to be a Pollyanna about things, not to be like, oh, everything's great, I'm a blind optimist, but to try and understand people. And I think whenever he came across somebody who he really disagreed with, he wouldn't attack them. He would try and figure out why they felt that way. And if they were angry, what had happened to them in their life that made them an angry person. That kind of sense of empathy and understanding, I'm sure, would be how he would be trying to understand the world today, as overwhelming as it is. So kind of the question I come to at the end of the film is, and in fact, it was Mrs. Rogers said this to me very bluntly. She said, we don't know what Fred would do because Fred's dead and he's not here, and we shouldn't be thinking about that. The essential question is, what are we going to do? And when I think Fred's legacy, you know, if you try and think of who's the new Mr. Rogers, well, there is no new Mr. Rogers, and there never will be a new Mr. Rogers. And nobody's going to fill that kind of a role in our culture anymore. But for the millions and millions and millions of people that watched his show, that he put a little bit of his values set in, and a little bit of his humanity in, and all of us who carry a little bit of him with us, I feel like we're all the next Mr. Rogers. You know, we all have the responsibility to do a little bit of that. All of those of us who learned something from him have to kind of pay that forward as much as we can. So that's how I like to think about it.
And I like the fact that you introduce very early on into the film, and really you don't avoid it, you don't glance away. The fact, you say he was a lifelong Republican, there's he was religious, and so are associations. Of course, if you grow up in cities, or if you are a Democrat, or however you identify, there's us and them, but it seemed that he had, this philosophy that there is no us and them, there is just you and you and you and you.
Well, I mean, won't you be my neighbor? It's essentially these fundamental questions of how should we treat each other and how should we treat ourselves? And if you can just strip it back to the basic ideas of what can we agree upon? What are the rules we can have a neighborhood together with? What are those basic things that allow us to live in the same society, the same culture? Those things feel under threat. Those are things that we feel like people can't even agree about that. And so, I feel like going back, let's go back and learn these lessons again. What do we need to learn about, or for Mr. Rogers to kind of understand what kind of a neighborhood we need to have? What does it mean to be a good neighbor? What's the value of neighborliness and kindness? And God knows in our culture, it's a lot easier to kind of make money through divisiveness and anger, or to get elected, than it is through kindness. There's no kindness lobby in our culture. It's hard to make money off of just goodness. But that's exactly what Fred wanted us to do. So I'm just trying to, when I digested Fred's message down to one bumper sticker, what I came up with was radical kindness. This idea of kindness above all, extreme kindness, it's grace, it's the idea of doing it for the sake of being kind. And that may sound quaint, but I'm here to be a warrior for kindness.
Warrior for kindness. Focus Features is like, maybe we can make money out of it. Maybe we can. Other questions over on this side? We've been calling this one. Oh yeah, what's up?
Hi, I first wanted to say I loved 20 Feet from Stardom, and as a musician, I called all my band after, and I was like, I love you so much, I'm sorry. They told me I was nice, but I was just so paranoid after I watched it. So I still own it, it's really good. But my question is a little bit on the nerdy side. I'm a YouTube kid as well, and I was just curious, I don't know if you know this or not, but it seemed like in the film, which was great, that Mr. Rogers took some time off from the show and then kind of jump right back into it. Do you know what his relationship was like with the network? Like, were they kind of waiting on him to come back, or was it just really easy for him to kind of pitch again? And because that's like kind of a big deal to just step away from like your full-time job to be like, JK, I'm the boss. Like, I thought it was cool how he came back.
I mean, he did that sabbatical for a couple of years, 3 years in the 70s. And that's when he did 2 seasons of this adult show, Old Friends, New Friends. And part of it was, I think part of him doing the adult show, I mean, I think he wanted to try it, but I think he created a family with that show, and I feel like his loyalty was more worrying about the people who worked for him on the show and feeling like they all had something to do together too. Because in terms of himself, he came from money. He didn't need money, and he turned down endless amounts of money. He was very well known there, very famous. When he went off the air in 1976, 1 in 12 households was watching that show every day. There's a show for 2 to 6 year olds, which means there were a lot of people that were not 2 to 6 that were watching that show every day. I mean, that's an incredible market share. He refused to sell toys. He refused to do so many things because he felt it would pollute his relationship with kids if he was trying to market to them at the same time he was trying to be their friend. So I don't think that kind of a thing was a consideration. I think anybody would have given him money. Network TV would have given him money. People wanted him to go to New York or LA and do shows, and he turned them all down. It was very important to him that everything stay in Pittsburgh, and that kept it very rooted. So he was really lucky that way.
All right, we have one last question, and it's got to be really good. It's got to be really good. Is it good? All right, microphone's going to you.
Okay, so I want to start by saying I love the film. It really talked to me, and it kind of has to do with what you were saying. He did take a sabbatical, and when he went away and started the adult show, as it kind of called out to all of us, and I think a lot of us felt the same way as I'm feeling. I was crying here, but why do you feel like, especially since a lot of household, including, obviously over 2 to 6, were watching the show, why do you feel, I don't know if you would be able to answer this, but why would that wouldn't have been received like he intended, obviously, for adults specifically?
I've thought about this a lot. And I think that, see, the thing is, kids are incredibly open. A child will tell you exactly what they think, exactly what they feel. They'll ask exactly what they want to know. As you grow up, you mask your intentions, you hide your feelings, you disguise your motives, you take on all those trappings. Fred had zero patience for that. He would go straight for, what are you feeling? Who are you? Why are you? How do you feel about this? In a way that I think honestly just intimidated a lot of adults. I think that was the thing. His emotional directness was that of a child's, and I say that as the biggest compliment. And that was something that, I think was just too honest, too emotionally direct